I thank the forum for inviting me to this conference, particularly because, as you can see from the panel, we have specialists on early childhood care and development, and we have specialists on finance, and I'm neither. The only reason that I do budget analysis is because, as Mr. Bose said in the morning, Mr. Sumit Bose, because I believe that budget is a very important tool for holding state accountable, for monitoring state performance, and to ensure transparency and accountability of governments. That's the only reason I do budgets, and my understanding, therefore, of budgets is also very minimalistic. It's only to that extent that I can hold the state accountable. If we were to, the context of budgeting for children and financing their rights has, if it's to be on the principle of equity, it has to be based on three critical principles, and against which we must ensure whether we are looking at our finances. One is non-discrimination, the other is indivisibility of rights, and then lastly, the best interest principle. So are we in any way violating any of these principles when we are financing is the bottom line. And I'm going to use the example of India to raise a few questions around financing for the young child. So here is the numbers and the context that we're looking at. And most importantly, as someone pointed out this morning, these are all the children who we're talking about. We're talking about 158 million children. We're talking about children, and the context was laid out very clearly in the morning by Vinita, so I'm not going to repeat, but we're talking about malnourished children, we're talking about unprotected children, we're talking about children who are sexually abused and vulnerable to violence. And in that context, what do we have in terms of a policy? If India is an example, then we find that the right to education does not include the early childhood care part of it. Despite going to court, what we have is a right to education that's only for 6 to 14, which means that the 0 to 6 is left to the Constitution as a directive principle. All our labor laws have provisions for creche facilities. Are they being financed? We have national plans of action, we have a national policy, we have, interestingly, a separate early childhood care, an ECCE policy which was recently adopted in 2013. We also have an education curriculum framework. And of course, all other provisions for children would apply to children. Here, I am going to leave you with a question. There is a demand from people who work on early childhood care in India that there should be a separate law. Now, what does a separate law mean in terms of finances? Because every law must have a financial memorandum to it. But what does it mean to have a law? Should we have special laws for every category of children? Or should we be able to finance and budget for all categories of children by mainstreaming their rights? That's the question I shall leave for you. We have international standards for finance resourcing ECCE. We have a general comment to the CRC, which lays down very clearly that resource allocation is required under Article 4 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and our national policy on ECCE also talks about financing and resourcing. But then, as someone raised a question, I think the gentleman from UNICEF Chhattisgarh said, whose concern is finally the young child? They are spread across different ministries, they're separate departments if they're in the states, and that is probably true because a child's needs is diverse. It would be true of any country. Then who then takes the main onus of financing and budgeting for the young child? I would also ask another question. Are we talking about ECCD, which means a little larger than an ECCE? So then what happens to finances? Except for one scheme, all other schemes in India, for example, fall under the Ministry of Women and Child, who have no experience on education. Now, just to give you you're not supposed to read this. This is just to give you an example of the number of schemes and number of programs that actually impact the young child in India. And they fall under all of these categories, which is Ministry of Health, Human Resource Development. Then the child care services would go under both the Ministry of Women and Child and under the labor ministries, and there's nutrition, and then of course there's social protection, which we seldom talk about. We hardly ever talk about protection rights of the young child, and therefore what kind of budgeting would be required to protect them from abuse. In a sort of ballpark figure, when we tried to do, my colleague is sitting here, she helped me to do a sort of a ballpark figure for the average spending on the young child, looking at all those ministries that in those small that we looked at here, and all we got from all of these departments and all of these ministries was only a 1.16% of the union budget. Now, as Mr. Bose also pointed out, the overall resourcing for children is going down in the country. And we do know that while many children are left out, if you're going to go by the non-discrimination principle, there is an urban-rural divide. In fact, the ICDS, which is our main program and has been referred to several times, it's the rural child who uses it much more than the urban child. The urban child, it's abysmal how, it's bad enough how it's implemented in the rural areas, but if you look at the urban child care center under the ICDS, there's nothing there. It's a feeding center. Then, of course, there are the children who are marginalized, like the Dalits or the tribals, who are further left out, and the disabled child hardly ever finds a space. So these are all those children who are left out of this 1.16 budget that we already have. There is, as was pointed out again in the morning, a very high dependence on the private sector, and we don't know how much of it is coming in from the private sector, but we do know that the minute anyone can afford anything better, they move to the private sector. But there is no, we do not have an estimate of the numbers that it caters to, nor the resources that are spent by families on the private sector. So, my question therefore then comes to where should the resources come from? And I think that's an important question that we need to ask, and I'm going to leave you with these questions, because if you're going to go by the human rights principle, then to my mind, state is the principal duty bearer. And therefore, we should not, the involvement of the private sector or the civil society must not mean abdication of state responsibility. And how do we ensure, therefore, lack of leakage, corruption, and ensure greater transparency? And how do we ensure that the 2% cess of the CSR that comes in, where should it go? Should it be augmenting the government services, or should it be allowed to run parallel services? So I'm going to leave you with just these three questions. One is, how do we track budgets? Two, how do we not just invest the money, but also ensure utilization and spending? Because the track record is that there is much more, what is invested is not spent. And we ensure it is based on universality and non-discrimination. What should the role of civil society and the private sector be? How do we ensure that the state does not, we do not, in our effort to augment services, lead to abdication of state responsibility? And how do we ensure that we value ECCD? And I'm going to leave you with this one information, that our Anganwadi workers and our creche workers are not even paid minimum wages. And therefore, that is the value that we give to the young child. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Enakshi. I'm going to invite Anit to the podium.